In 1995, a Montreal beat cop named Louis Cyr put 4,337 pounds on his back and stood up with it, and nobody filmed a single second of it because there was nothing to film it for. Today, a man will rack a set of curls and check the mirror before he checks the weight, and the strange truth is that the difference between those two men has almost nothing to do with vanity. Cyr was born in 1863 in a Quebec farming village, and by his 20s, he was working as a police officer in Saint-Cunegonde, a rough district on the edge of Montreal. He was not hired for his paperwork. The story that follows him around, and it shows up in enough independent retellings that there is probably something to it, is that he once broke up a street fight by picking up both brawlers, one under each arm, and carrying them to the station house like a man carrying groceries. Whether that specific incident happened exactly as described is anyone's guess. What is not in dispute is that a man's physical power in 1895 was a functional credential, something an employer could use. That is the world this video lives in. From roughly 1890 to 1939, the era historians of the sport now call the Bronze Era, when strength was not an aesthetic category, but an occupational one. And the argument here is simple enough to state and strange enough to be worth 3,000 words. Vanity is not a modern invention. Accountability is what went missing. Because here's the thing that surprises people. The Bronze Era absolutely had preening. It had oiled bodies, souvenir photographs, and men who measured their own arms and then told everyone about it. The difference is that in that world, if the image was not backed by a verifiable lift, someone would find out publicly, usually within a week, and usually on a stage in front of a paying audience. Start with the men whose bodies genuinely were tools, because that half of the story is real, and it is glorious. Arthur Saxon was a German strongman who toured Britain and Europe with his two brothers as the Saxon Trio, and he specialized in a lift that has basically vanished from modern gyms. The bent press is not a press in any sense a lifter today would recognize. You take a heavy weight in one hand at the shoulder, and instead of pushing it up, you bend your body away and down underneath it, screwing yourself into a position where the arm locks out almost by accident, and then you stand up. It rewards leverage, flexibility, and an almost unnatural tolerance for having a very large object hovering above your skull. Saxon did 371 pounds with one arm, sometime around 1905 or 1906, depending on which account you trust. And the mark has never been beaten in the century and changed since. Not because nobody is strong enough, but because the lift stopped being fashionable and nobody has trained it seriously at that level in decades. That is a mildly haunting thought. There is a strength record sitting on the shelf that no living person has bothered to chase. George Hackenschmidt was the intellectual of the group, which is not a sentence you get to write about many men who could deadlift a horse. Born in what is now Estonia in 1877, he became famous across Europe as the Russian Lion, a wrestler first and a strongman second, and in 1908 he published a book called The Way to Live. It is worth reading even now, and its entire premise is that training exists to make you capable of real work and real combat. Hackenschmidt wanted men to be useful. The squat variation that carries his name, the hack squat, comes from a lift he actually performed. And the fact that it survives as a leg machine in commercial gyms is one of history's better jokes on him. So that is one half of the argument, and it is airtight. Cyr lifted for wages. Saxon lifted to keep a touring act solvent. Hackenschmidt lifted to win wrestling matches against men who were actively trying to break him. And then there is the Prussian, who ruined everything. Friedrich Wilhelm Müller was born in Königsberg in 1867, ran away from home rather than serve in the army, drifted through Europe as a circus acrobat, and eventually rebranded himself with a stage name that sounded stronger than his real one, Eugen Sandow. And in 1889, in London, he did the single thing that made his career and arguably invented the modern fitness industry as a side effect. There was a stage strongman working the Royal Aquarium named Charles Sampson who had a standing challenge. Money to any man who could match his feats. Sandow, then completely unknown, turned up in evening dress, took the challenge, and won. What made it devastating was not just that he beat Sampson, but that he exposed how much of Samson's act depended on rigged apparatus, chains scored to snap on cue, that kind of thing. Sandow walked out of that building famous. Samson walked out of it finished. Now keep that in mind, because it matters for everything that follows. The man who built the entire culture of looking like a bodybuilder made his name by proving that another man was faking it. Sandow got very rich very fast. Florenz Ziegfeld, the impresario who would later create the Ziegfeld Follies, brought him to America and showcased him at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where he essentially discovered that women would pay extra to touch the muscles. Sandow leaned all the way in. He posed in nothing but a fig leaf, he sold photographs of himself, and by 1898 he was publishing his own magazine, and by 1897 running a chain of physical culture institutes across Britain. And this is the detail that gets me every single time. Sandow did not build his physique by chasing size. He built it by chasing proportion, and he got his numbers by going to the British Museum with a set of calipers and measuring the classical Greek statues. Actual calipers, actual marble. He worked out the ratios the Greeks had used, applied them to his own body, and trained the parts that fell short. That is a man building a physique to a spec sheet in the 1890s. If you handed him a smartphone, he would not have needed a tutorial. Which brings us to the 14th of September, 1901, and the Royal Albert Hall in London, and the night the whole thing tipped over. Sandow organized what he called the Great Competition. Regional heats had been run across Britain to narrow the field, and the finalists came to London to be judged not on what they could lift, but on how they looked. Symmetry, development, condition, general appearance. Sound familiar? The hall was packed. The judging panel had 3 men on it: Sandow himself, the sculptor Charles Laws, and, of all people, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, that Conan Doyle. The creator of Sherlock Holmes spent an evening in 1901 assessing the deltoids of British tradesmen, and by most accounts enjoyed himself enormously. The winner was a man from Nottingham named William L. Murray, and he went home with a gold statuette of Sandow himself cast holding a globe barbell. Hold on to that statuette. We are coming back to it. So by 1901, the aesthetic contest exists, the physique magazine exists, the mail order training course exists in embryo, and the celebrity strongman selling images of his own body absolutely exists. Every ingredient of what people now dismiss as modern narcissism was already assembled and profitable before the first Model T rolled off a line. It got worse, or better, depending on your mood. Bernard McFadden launched Physical Culture magazine in 1899 in the United States, and McFadden was not a subtle operator. His slogan was, "Weakness is a crime." He printed it, he shouted it, he built an empire on it, and he ran contests at Madison Square Garden to find what he billed as the world's most perfectly developed man. In the early 1920s, a skinny Italian immigrant named Angelo Siciliano won one of those contests. He had come to Brooklyn from Calabria as a boy, and by his own telling, he built himself up after a humiliating incident on Coney Island, though the specifics of that story shifted a bit over the years, which is what usually happens when a story becomes a sales pitch. He changed his name to Charles Atlas. And in 1929, with an advertising man named Charles Roman, Atlas launched the mail order course that would sell for the next 50 years. Dynamic Tension, and the advertisement Roman wrote was called The Insult That Made a Man Out of Mac, the comic strip where the bully kicks sand in the weakling's face at the beach. Now stop and look at that honestly, because it complicates the tidy version of this story. That advertisement is not selling survival. It is not selling work capacity or wrestling ability or the power to carry 2 drunks to a police station. It is selling social humiliation and the promise of revenge on it. It is a product built on insecurity, and it is sitting right there in 1929, deep inside the Bronze Era, a full generation before anyone had a gym mirror to stand in front of. So no, these men were not immune to vanity. They invented the marketing of it. Here's where the actual difference lives, and it is not where most people assume. The Bronze Era did not lack ego. It lacked the ability to get away with it. Consider Thomas Inch, a British strongman who held the title of Britain's strongest youth and spent decades on the music hall circuit. Inch had a dumbbell. It weighed 172 pounds, which is heavy but not absurd. The trick was the handle, which was roughly 2 3/8 of an inch thick, far too fat for a normal hand to close around properly. Inch offered cash to any man who could lift it off the floor with one hand. For years, essentially, nobody could. And the beautiful, brutal function of that dumbbell was that it existed almost entirely to embarrass men whose arms looked bigger than they lifted. A challenger with an impressive physique would step up in front of a paying crowd, wrap his hand around that handle, pull, and the thing would sit there like it was bolted to the stage. Inch would collect his money and his applause. The bell is still around today, and modern strongmen who have lifted it universally describe the handle as the whole problem. That was the era's immune system: public, physical, and unkind. The same principle ran through the print side of the sport. Alan Calvert founded the Milo Barbell Company in Philadelphia in 1902, selling the first mass-produced adjustable plate-loading barbells for home use in America. And around 1914, he started publishing Strength magazine. Calvert was a stickler. He wanted poundages documented. He was openly suspicious of inflated claims, and Strength became a place where numbers got scrutinized rather than simply printed. If a man claimed a lift, other lifters read it, and other lifters wrote in. And the touring structure did the rest. These men were performers who moved through the same halls, played to the same audiences, and read the same papers. A false claim was not an internet argument. It was an invitation for a rival to show up at your next booking with a loaded bar and a crowd who had paid to see what happened next, which is exactly what Sandow himself did to Samson in 1889. The whole culture ran on that threat. Sandow's own ending is a strange, sad, and genuinely uncertain thing, and it deserves to be told properly rather than repeated as the myth. He died in London in 1925, aged 58. The story that circulated for decades, and which you will still find repeated confidently, is that he ruptured a blood vessel single-handedly hauling a car out of a ditch after an accident and never recovered. It is a perfect death for the legend, which is probably why it stuck. The evidence for it is thin. His death certificate points to an aortic aneurysm, and later biographers have raised other possibilities entirely, including some that his family had good reason to keep quiet. I cannot tell you which version is true. What I can tell you is that the world's most photographed strongman was buried in an unmarked grave at Putney Vale, at his wife's insistence, and it stayed unmarked until 2002, when admirers finally paid for a headstone. The man who taught the world to look at muscle spent 77 years under an anonymous patch of grass. One last thing, and this one crosses eras, so it needs saying clearly. That gold statuette William Murray carried home from the Royal Albert Hall in 1901 disappeared as a prize after Sandow's competition ended. It sat dormant for the better part of a century. Then in 1977, deep in the golden era, the Sandow Trophy was revived and handed to the winner of the Mr. Olympia, where it remains the most recognizable prize in the sport. That revival is a modern callback, not an unbroken tradition. And anyone who tells you the lineage runs continuously from 1901 is compressing 76 years of history into a sentence. The Bronze Era itself closes around 1939. What comes next is a different chapter with different rules, opening with John Grymek taking the AAU Mr. America title in 1940 and again in 1941, the only man ever to win it twice, after which they changed the rules to stop him. That is the Silver Era, and it belongs to another video. So the honest verdict is not that these men were purer than us. Sear lifted for wages, and Saxon lifted for ticket sales, and Sandow lifted for the camera, sometimes all in the same decade. What separated them was that the receipt was always due, and the audience was always right there, waiting to see whether you could produce it. Next time somebody tells you the old-timers trained for function while modern lifters train for looks, remember that a Prussian showman was taking calipers to Greek statues in 1893. The vanity survived the century just fine. It was the loaded barbell in the corner of the room, the one that would tell everybody the truth in about 4 seconds, that we managed to lose along the way.